Inside the $53 million estate of the world's richest man. Explore the 56-room Fair Lane estate, the Dearborn, Michigan home of Clara and Henry Ford.
Welcome to Inside Grand Mansions. Don't forget to subscribe.
In 1914, while the rest of the world was descending into the chaos of the First World War, the wealthiest man in America was fighting a war of his own, right here on the banks of the Rouge River. Most billionaires of the Gilded Age built palaces to show off. The Vanderbilts built Biltmore to impress royalty. The Rockefellers built Kykuit to assert dominance over the Hudson Valley. But Henry Ford did not want a palace, and he certainly did not care about impressing royalty. He wanted a fortress. Fair Lane, located in Dearborn, Michigan, is a 31,000 square foot contradiction made of limestone and concrete. It is one of the first historic sites in America to be designated a National Historic Landmark. Yet for decades, the true story of this house was overshadowed by the titan of industry who built it. To the public, this was a home, but to Henry Ford, Fair Lane was a machine. It was designed to be a self-sufficient, independent kingdom where he could control everything, from the electricity that lit the halls to the very temperature of the air to the private lives of the people who lived inside. This is the story of the house that paranoia built. To understand the house, you have to understand the money behind it and the peculiar psychology of the man who spent it. By 1913, the Ford Motor Company wasn't just successful, it was an economic supernova. Henry Ford had introduced the moving assembly line, fundamentally changing the human relationship with manufacturing. He was producing a Model T every 93 minutes. He wasn't just rich, he was the first billionaire of the common man. But extreme wealth brought extreme isolation. While Detroit's elite were clustering together in the mansions of Grosse Pointe, sipping champagne and networking in high society ballrooms, Ford hated them. He viewed the bankers and the socialites as parasites. He did not want to live near them, and he refused to play by their rules. He wanted to go back to the land he grew up on. He chose a plot of 1,300 acres in Dearborn, miles away from polite society. It was mostly farmland and forest surrounding the Rouge River. He envisioned a home that would blend into the landscape, a place where he could escape the celebrity he had created. But Henry Ford had a problem. He was a genius at building cars, but he was a nightmare at building houses. The construction of Fair Lane would become a chaotic reflection of Ford's own mind, brilliant, erratic, and impossible to satisfy. The trouble started immediately with the design. Ford originally hired the architectural firm of Von Holst and Fife, but the real genius behind the initial concept was Marian Mahoney Griffin. She was a brilliant architect, a contemporary of Frank Lloyd Wright, and one of the first licensed female architects in the world. She designed a masterpiece for Ford in the Prairie School style. Her vision was low-slung, with horizontal lines blending seamlessly with the flat Michigan earth. It was modern, artistic, and forward-thinking. And Henry Ford absolutely hated it. The conflict between Ford and his architects is legendary. Ford did not care about aesthetics, he cared about utility and solidity. He would walk through the construction site, pointing at load-bearing walls and demanding they be moved simply because he didn't like where they stood. He demanded changes to the foundation that defied physics. When Griffin and the architects pushed back, explaining that you cannot move structural elements on a whim, Ford did what he did best. He fired them. He didn't just fire the architects, he effectively fired the style itself. He looked at the half-finished modern house and decided he wanted something else entirely. He wanted weight. He wanted permanence. So, in a move that baffled the architectural world, he brought in William Van Tyne to take a half-built prairie-style house and wrap it in limestone to look like a European fortress. The result is one of the strangest architectural hybrids in America, a house with the bones of a modernist masterpiece trapped inside the skin of a medieval Scottish baronial castle. That struggle between the modern and the past, between function and beauty, would define the rest of Henry Ford's life. As you approach the estate today, you are struck by that heaviness. The exterior is clad in rough-hewn limestone, quarried in Ohio and hauled to Michigan. It feels impenetrable. This was intentional. Ford was becoming increasingly paranoid about his safety and the safety of his family. He didn't just want a home, he wanted a secure perimeter. The walls are thick, the windows are heavy, and the layout of the grounds was designed to control exactly who could see the house and when. But the house itself was only one component of the estate. The true heart of Fairlane, and the structure that reveals the most about Henry Ford's soul, is not the living room or the library, it is the powerhouse. While other millionaires were building ballrooms and guest cottages, Ford spent millions building a massive, functional hydroelectric dam on the Rouge River. He was obsessed with the idea of self-reliance. He did not want to pay the electric company, he wanted to own the electricity. The construction of the dam was a monumental engineering feat for a private residence. It required bending the river to his will. The powerhouse was equipped with the finest turbines available, and the interior was finished not like a factory, but like a cathedral of industry with marble floors and brass fittings. It was here, in the deafening hum of the turbines, that Henry Ford felt most at home. This powerhouse provided everything for the estate: electricity, heat, pumped water, and even the power to make ice. It allowed Fairlane to be cut off from the rest of the world and survive entirely on its own. However, the dam caused problems that rippled out into the community, foreshadowing Ford's complicated relationship with the public. By manipulating the river's flow, he altered the water table for his neighbors. But Ford, convinced of his own righteousness, pressed on. In his mind, he was improving nature, making it more efficient. This was the same philosophy he applied to his factories and eventually to his workforce.
The interior of the main house, once completed in 1915, was a reflection of this split personality. It cost nearly $2 million to build, a staggering sum at the time, equivalent to over $50 million today. Yet when you step inside, it does not feel like the gilded cages of the East Coast elite. There is very little gold leaf. There are no soaring, echoing ballrooms designed for hundreds of dancers. Instead, the rooms are intimate, dark, and heavy with wood. The entrance hall sets the tone. It is paneled in English oak, dark and brooding. The grand staircase is sturdy, built to last 1,000 years. But look closer and you see the innovations. Ford installed a central vacuum system, a rarity for the time. He had a complex telephone intercom system installed, so he could reach any servant in any room instantly. The house was wired for sound, a technology in its infancy. He was using his home as a laboratory for the technologies of the future, even as he decorated it to look like a castle from the past. One of the most telling rooms on the first floor is the library. This was Henry's sanctuary. It is a long, rectangular room filled with books, but not just the classics. Ford was a voracious reader of technical manuals, essays, and philosophy. It was in this room that he would sit by the fire, often alone, reading late into the night. But this room also houses a darker history. It was at this desk that Ford began to formulate and edit some of his most controversial writings. The isolation of Fairlane, which he craved, also created an echo chamber. Without the social checks and balances of a community, his ideas began to drift into dangerous territories, fed by his own paranoia and unchecked power. Connecting the main house to the powerhouse is a tunnel system. This is a feature you see in many great estates, usually for servants to move unseen. But at Fairlane, the tunnels were also about security and utility. Ford loved the idea that the veins of the house, the steam pipes, the electric cables were accessible and visible to him.
He wanted to see how the machine worked. He would often take guests not to the garden first, but into the tunnels and the basement to show off the boilers. To him, the beauty of the house wasn't in the drapes or the paintings, it was in the boiler pressure gauges.
The layout of the estate was also heavily influenced by Ford's close friend and famous naturalist John Burroughs and the landscape architect Jens Jensen. Jensen is a legend in his own right, the father of the prairie style of landscape architecture. He believed in using native plants and following the natural lines of the land. This clashed, interestingly, with Ford's desire for control, but they found a middle ground. Jensen designed the meadow, a vast, open, grassy area that looks completely natural but was actually painstakingly engineered. Jensen created what is known as the delayed view. As you drive up the long, winding driveway of Fair Lane, you do not see the house for a long time. The road curves through the trees, giving you glimpses of the river, glimpses of the meadow, but keeping the destination hidden. Then, at the very last moment, the trees break and the massive stone fortress is revealed right in front of you. This was psychological architecture. It was designed to make the visitor feel small and to make the revelation of the house feel like an event. It was a power move etched into the landscape. By 1916, the Fords, Henry, his wife Clara, and their son Edsel had fully moved in. For Clara, Fair Lane was a dream come true. She was a gardener, a lover of roses, and she finally had the canvas she had always wanted. She poured her soul into the gardens, creating one of the most spectacular rose gardens in America. For Henry, it was a base of operations, but for Edsel, the sensitive and artistic heir to the throne, Fair Lane would become a gilded cage. The heavy stone walls that kept the public out also kept Edsel in, under the constant critical gaze of his father.
The dynamic within the house was stiff and formal. Despite being one of the richest families in the world, the Fords lived relatively quietly. They did not throw Gatsby-style parties. Dinner was served at a specific time. Alcohol was largely frowned upon. The house was quiet. The silence was only broken by the chiming of the clocks. Henry loved clocks and repaired them as a hobby, and the distant hum of the powerhouse. It was a serious house for a serious man. As we move deeper into the structure in the next part, we will explore the private wing of the house, the unbelievable swimming pool room that was heated by steam tunnels, and the tragic rustic room, where Henry tried to relate to a son he didn't understand. We will see how Fair Lane wasn't just a place to sleep, it was the command center for a global empire and the stage for a family tragedy that would play out over the next 3 decades. The stone walls were built to last forever, but the family inside was beginning to fracture. Part 2. The Machine for Living. Once you cross the threshold of the heavy oak doors and step deeper into Fair Lane, the house begins to reveal itself not as a static monument, but as a living, breathing organism. While the entrance hall was designed to impress with its weight and tradition, the private wings of the house were designed for a very specific kind of life, Henry Ford's life. The first stop that truly showcases the billionaire's obsession with health and mechanics is the indoor swimming pool room. In 1915, an indoor residential pool was an unimaginable luxury, something reserved for royalty. But for Ford, it wasn't just about leisure, it was about maintenance. The pool room is a marvel of early 20th century engineering. The water was heated, of course, but the room itself featured heated marble benches. These benches were warmed by steam pipes running directly from the powerhouse through the tunnel system we explored earlier. Ford could sit on the marble after a swim, and the stone itself would be warm to the touch. The pool was lined with iridescent tiles that shimmered under the skylights, creating a serene, almost clinical atmosphere. This was where Henry Ford exercised, obsessively maintaining his physique well into his older years. He was known for challenging younger men to foot races and jumping over tables to prove his vitality, and this pool was the engine of that fitness. Just off the main recreational areas lies one of the most baffling rooms in the entire mansion, the rustic room. If the rest of the house was a confused mix of prairie style and Scottish castle, the rustic room was a complete departure from reality. It was designed to look exactly like a rough-hewn log cabin or a hunting lodge, but it is located inside the stone walls of a mansion. The walls are lined with raw timber. The fireplace is made of rough fieldstone, and the furniture looks like it was carved by hand in the woods. This room is a psychological map of Henry Ford's nostalgia. He was the man who destroyed the rural 19th century way of life with his cars and factories, yet he spent his vast fortune trying to recreate that lost world inside his own home. He would sit in this fake cabin surrounded by millions of dollars of limestone, pretending to be a simple country boy. Moving through the corridors, you begin to notice the invisible infrastructure that kept Fairlane running. The house was equipped with a central vacuuming system, a network of tubes hidden in the walls that sucked dust down to a central canister in the basement. This meant servants didn't have to carry heavy machinery from room to room. They simply plugged a hose into the wall. It was efficient, hygienic, and thoroughly modern. The kitchen, too, was an industrial marvel. It featured refrigeration systems cooled by brine pumped from the powerhouse, stainless steel surfaces that could be sterilized, and warming ovens to ensure food never reached the table cold. It was run with the precision of an assembly line. But to find the true soul of Henry Ford, you have to leave the main house and walk to the garage. Calling it a garage is an understatement. It was a temple to the automobile. It was built to hold the family's fleet of Lincolns and Fords, but it also contained a mechanism that delighted every visitor, an automobile turntable. The driveway at Fairlane was narrow, and Ford didn't like the indignity of backing a car out. So, upon driving into the garage, the car would be parked on a circular platform. With a push of a button, or in the early days, a manual lever, the floor would rotate 180 degrees, pointing the car back toward the door, ready for a quick exit. It was a practical solution that became a symbol of status. Above the garage was Henry's true sanctuary, his private laboratory. While Clara controlled the gardens and the staff controlled the kitchen, the lab was Henry's domain. It was here, far away from the boardrooms of Detroit and the prying eyes of the press, that Ford felt most himself. The lab was a massive open space filled with beakers, engine parts, bushels of crops, and tools. This was not a hobby room, it was a research and development facility. It was here that Ford began his obsessive experiments with soybeans. He was convinced that agriculture and industry could be merged, believing he could build car parts out of soy-based plastics. In this laboratory, the smell was a mixture of oil, dirt, and chemicals. Ford would spend hours here, often late into the night. He would invite his favorite engineers to join him, bypassing the bureaucracy of the Ford Motor Company to work on projects in secret. They tinkered with new engine designs, experimented with alternative fuels, and tested materials. This room reveals the central conflict of Ford's life. He was a billionaire who hated the trappings of wealth. He didn't want to sit in the library reading poetry. He wanted to be in the lab, getting his hands greasy, taking things apart to see how they worked. Fairlane allowed him to be the mechanic he was at heart, protected by the walls of the estate. The estate also featured a bowling alley, a common feature in the homes of the wealthy, but Ford's version was characteristically austere. It wasn't a place for drinking and raucous parties, it was for exercise. He expected his family to use it to stay fit. The wood of the lanes was impeccably maintained, and like everything else in the house, it was kept in perfect working order. If a pin setter malfunctioned, Ford would likely want to fix it himself. However, the house was not just designed for Henry, it was designed to hide the people who served him. The servant quarters were extensive, occupying their own wing. The architecture employed a series of blind doors cut into the wood paneling of the main hallways that were invisible when closed. This allowed maids and butlers to step into a room, deliver a service, and vanish without disrupting the visual flow of the space. Ford demanded absolute efficiency from his staff, much like he did from his factory workers. He paid them well, better than most other domestic staff in the country, but in exchange, he demanded total adherence to his rules. There was no drinking, no smoking, and their private lives were subject to his scrutiny. This scrutiny extended to his own son, Edsel. Edsel's rooms at Fairlane tell a heartbreaking story of a young man trying to find his own identity in the shadow of a tyrant. Edsel loved art, music, and modern design. He tried to introduce softer, more aesthetic touches to his private spaces, but the heavy stone of Fair Lane always dominated. The house felt suffocating to Edsel. While Henry retreated to his lab or the rustic room to indulge his fantasies, Edsel was trapped in the formal spaces, forced to play the role of the dutiful heir. The tension between the father and son was palpable in the architecture itself, Henry's heavy, fortress-like walls pressing in on Edsel's desire for light and beauty. As the 1920s roared on, Fair Lane became more than a home. It became a fortress against a changing world. The security protocols were tightened. The gatehouse at the entrance was manned 24 hours a day. Ford began to receive death threats as his public persona became more controversial. The isolation of the estate, once a preference, became a necessity. The tunnels, the powerhouse, the self-sufficiency, it all began to feel less like innovation and more like preparation for a siege. The delayed view driveway that was meant to be artistic now served a tactical purpose, preventing anyone from seeing the house until they were already deep inside the grounds. By the end of the 1920s, the house had settled into its rhythm. The staff knew the routine. The master would rise early, inspect the grounds, check the powerhouse, and perhaps spend time in the lab. But outside the limestone walls, the world was turning against Henry Ford. His anti-Semitic writings in the Dearborn Independent, his brutal treatment of labor organizers, and his refusal to update the Model T were chipping away at his reputation. The fortress he built to keep the world out was starting to feel like a prison. And inside that prison, the relationship between Henry and Edsel was about to reach its breaking point, a tragedy that would haunt the halls of Fair Lane forever. By the 1930s, the atmosphere inside Fair Lane had shifted. The golden light of the early years, filled with the optimism of the Model T and the hum of the powerhouse, had dimmed. The Great Depression was ravaging the country, and the public adoration that Henry Ford once enjoyed had turned into resentment. The estate, once a sanctuary for a brilliant inventor, began to resemble a bunker for a paranoid tycoon. The heavy limestone walls, originally designed for privacy, now seemed to be holding back a siege. It was during these years that the darker aspects of Henry Ford's personality, which had always been present, began to consume him, and the house became the stage for a domestic Cold War. The paranoia that gripped Ford was not entirely unfounded, but it was exacerbated by the company he kept. The most significant figure in this dark chapter was not a family member, but a man named Harry Bennett. Bennett was Ford's head of security, a former boxer with ties to the underworld and a penchant for violence. He became Ford's enforcer and his closest confidant, largely displacing Edsel in his father's orbit. While Bennett did not live at Fair Lane, his shadow was everywhere. The security protocols at the estate were tightened to an obsessive degree. The gatehouse became a checkpoint. Ford began carrying a gun. The intricate telephone system, once a tool for efficiency, became a tool for surveillance. The estate felt less like a home and more like a command post for a war against labor unions, competitors, and the changing world. It is impossible to tell the story of Fair Lane without addressing the poison that flowed from its library. In that beautiful room, surrounded by shelves of walnut and the warmth of the fireplace, Henry Ford championed some of the most hateful rhetoric of the 20th century. He purchased a local newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, and used it to publish a series of anti-Semitic articles that were distributed globally. These writings, which blamed Jewish people for everything from war to economic collapse, were not just a side project, they were a central obsession. It is a chilling juxtaposition. The man who built this magnificent estate, who loved birdwatching in his gardens and old-time fiddling in his music room, was simultaneously using his immense resources to spread hatred. The library at Fair Lane stands as a monument to the complexity of human nature, how genius and ignorance can coexist in the same mind, in the same room. This need for control extended far beyond the walls of the estate and into the homes of his workers. Ford established the Sociological Department, a team of inspectors who would visit the homes of his employees to ensure they were living up to Ford's moral standards. They checked for cleanliness, sobriety, and marital fidelity. If a worker failed these inspections, they could lose their job. In many ways, Ford was trying to turn every worker's home into a miniature Fairlane, a place of rigid order, cleanliness, and efficiency. He could not understand why people would want to live differently than he did. He believed he had solved the problem of living, and he was determined to impose that solution on the world, whether they wanted it or not. But the most heartbreaking conflict took place inside the family itself. The relationship between Henry and his son, Edsel, is the central tragedy of the Ford dynasty. Edsel was everything Henry was not: artistic, sensitive, refined, and kind. He was a brilliant executive in his own right, with a taste for modern design that would eventually save the company. But Henry viewed these traits as weaknesses. He bullied Edsel relentlessly. He undermined his authority in front of employees, countermanded his orders, and openly mocked his tastes. Fairlane was the arena where this psychological abuse played out.
The contrast between the two men was physically developing in the architecture they chose. While Henry stayed in his dark fortress like Fairlane, Edsel built his own estate, Gawkler Point, in Grosse Pointe Shores. Edsel's home was a masterpiece of Cotswold style, lighter, filled with art, and welcoming to the very society people Henry despised. Henry hated Edsel's house. He saw it as a rejection of his values. When Henry visited Gawkler Point, he would often criticize the furniture or the layout, unable to let his son have a victory even in his own home. Back at Fairlane, Henry tried to toughen up Edsel. The rustic room we explored earlier was part of this. Henry wanted Edsel to be a rough-and-tumble outdoorsman, but Edsel was a man of the salon and the design studio. The harder Henry pushed, the more the distance between them grew. The tension at Fairlane was palpable during family dinners. The silence of the house, usually broken only by the clocks, was now heavy with unsaid words. Clara Ford, Henry's wife, was caught in the middle. She adored her son and she loved her husband, but she was often unable or unwilling to stop Henry's cruelty. She created the Rose Garden as her escape, a labyrinth of beauty where she could disappear for hours. It was one of the few places on the estate where the industrial discipline of Henry Ford did not reach. But even the gardens could not hide the rotting core of the family dynamic. As the years wore on, the stress began to physically destroy Edsel. He developed stomach ulcers, a condition exacerbated by the constant anxiety of dealing with his father and Harry Bennett. Henry, who distrusted doctors and believed that diet and exercise could cure anything, accused Edsel of hypochondria. He told him to stop complaining and get back to work. He believed the ulcers were a sign of weakness, a character flaw, rather than a medical condition. In the hallways of Fairlane, where Henry bounded upstairs to prove his fitness, Edsel was withering away. The healthiest house in America, with its filtered air and pure water, could not save the heir from the toxicity of his father.
The breaking point came in 1943. Edsel Ford died of stomach cancer and undulant fever at the age of 49. He had been worked to death and stressed to the breaking point by the man who claimed to love him most. When the news reached Fairlane, the fortress finally cracked. Henry was devastated. The grief was instant and shattering. For all his bullying, he had expected Edsel to outlive him, to take over the empire, to eventually become the tough leader Henry wanted. He never imagined that his own pressure would help put his son in an early grave. The atmosphere at Fairlane after Edsel's death was ghostly. The house, which had been a bustle of activity and innovation, fell silent. Henry was 80 years old. He had suffered a series of strokes. The titan of industry was beginning to fade. He would wander the halls of the limestone mansion at night, confused and weeping. He would sometimes speak to Edsel as if he were still there. The powerhouse kept humming, the servants kept the house spotless, but the spirit of the place had been broken.
The controversies that had swirled around Ford, the strikes, the anti-Semitism, the violence, seemed to recede into the background, replaced by the sheer weight of the loss. The man of the century was now just a lonely old man in a big stone house surrounded by the remnants of his control. Realizing too late that control is not the same thing as love. The estate had been built to be a self-sufficient world, a place where Henry Ford needed no one. In the end, he got exactly what he wanted. He was alone in his fortress. But the story of Fairlane does not end with Henry's decline. There was one final act to play out, a battle for the soul of the company and the estate itself. The Ford name was at risk of disappearing under the mismanagement of a senile Henry and the scheming Harry Bennett. It would take the women of Fairlane, Clara Ford and Edsel's widow, Eleanor, to finally stand up to the old man and save the legacy. In the final part of our story, we will see the end of the era, the death of the creator, and the incredible resurrection of the house today. We will see how Fairlane went from a dark fortress of sorrow back to a beacon of history, currently undergoing one of the largest historic restorations in the country. Part 4. The Ghost in the Machine. The death of Edsel Ford in 1943 did not just break Henry's heart, it broke the chain of command. With the heir apparent gone, the Ford Motor Company began to circle the drain. Henry, now senile and increasingly erratic, nominally took back the presidency, but the real power lay in the hands of Harry Bennett, the security chief who had terrorized the family for years. Bennett had visions of taking over the empire himself. He had manipulated the old man into a state of dependency, isolating him further within the stone walls of Fairlane. For a moment, it seemed as if the Ford legacy would end not with a family member, but with a gangster. But the fortress of control had two other inhabitants who had been underestimated for decades: Clara Ford and her daughter-in-law, Eleanor. In a stunning display of steel that rivaled Henry's own, the women of the family took charge. Eleanor, Edsel's widow, refused to let her son, Henry Ford II, be bypassed. She issued an ultimatum that shook the walls of the estate. If Henry did not fire Harry Bennett and hand the company over to his grandson, she would sell her stock. This would have forced the company to go public, destroying the absolute control Henry had fought his entire life to maintain. Clara, the loyal wife who had stood by Henry through every controversy, finally sided with Eleanor. She told Henry it was time to let go. Facing the rebellion of the only people he had left, the Titan surrendered. Henry Ford II took the throne, Bennett was fired, and the old man retreated into the shadows of Fairlane for good. The final years at the estate were quiet, almost haunting. Henry spent his days wandering the grounds he had engineered. He would visit the powerhouse to watch the turbines spin, perhaps finding comfort in the only things that still worked exactly as he intended. He was often seen by the staff staring at the portrait of Edsel, weeping. The paranoia had faded into a gentle confusion. The man who had reshaped the globe with the automobile was now content to take long car rides through the countryside, watching the world he created blur past the window. The end came on April 7, 1947. And it arrived with a poetic irony that no screenwriter could invent. The Rouge River, the very waterway Henry had dammed and manipulated to power his estate, rose up in a massive flood. The waters breached the banks and swamped the powerhouse. The fires in the boilers were extinguished, the turbines ground to a halt. For the first time in decades, the hum of the machine stopped. The electricity at Fairlane failed. The heat died. The phones went dead. The fortress was completely cut off from the world, rendered powerless by the nature Henry had tried so hard to tame. That night, in a cold, dark room, lit only by the flickering light of oil lamps and candles, Henry Ford died of a cerebral hemorrhage. He was 83 years old. The man who had brought the modern world into existence, who had electrified the farm and put the world on wheels, left this life exactly as he had entered it, in a cold room lit by candlelight with no modern conveniences to save him. The irony was absolute. The machine had finally stopped. After Henry's death, Clara lived on at Fairlane for 3 more years, the lone custodian of the memories. When she passed in 1950, the house faced an uncertain future. For most estates of this size, this is the moment of destruction. The Gilded Age mansions were being torn down all over America, replaced by subdivisions. But Fairlane was too significant and perhaps too heavy to simply disappear. The Ford Motor Company purchased the estate and used it for corporate archives. For a time, the bedrooms where Henry and Clara slept were filled with filing cabinets. The library where the anti-Semitic tracts were written became a storage room for company records. It was a sterile, bureaucratic existence for a home that had been so full of passion and conflict. In 1957, the company donated the estate to the University of Michigan to establish its Dearborn campus. For decades, the mansion served as a university building. Students walked the halls where the captains of industry once debated the fate of the economy. Offices were partitioned. Fluorescent lights were drilled into the intricate plaster ceilings. While the university saved the building from demolition, the delicate fabrics, the custom furniture, and the subtle prairie-style details were slowly eroded or covered up. The house was surviving, but it was losing its soul. It was becoming just another old building. However, in 2013, a new chapter began. The ownership of the estate was transferred to a new nonprofit, the Henry Ford Estate, dedicated solely to its restoration. This was not a simple remodeling job. It was an archaeological dig. The goal was to return the house to exactly how it looked in 1919, the peak of its glory. This process has revealed the incredible attention to detail that Henry Ford originally demanded. Restorers have spent years peeling back layers of paint to find the original colors. They have tracked down the original furniture, much of which had been scattered to museums and private collections. They are repairing the intricate stonework of the exterior, which had suffered from a century of Michigan winters. But the most impressive work is happening underground. The powerhouse, the heart of the estate, is being brought back online. The goal is not just to fix the dam, but to make it functional again, to have the river once again powering the lights of Fairlane. It is a restoration of the system, not just the aesthetics. As you walk through the estate today, even in its state of restoration, you can feel the presence of the man. You feel it in the heavy doors that swing with the precision of a bank vault. You feel it in the rustic room with its desperate attempt to capture a simpler time. You feel it in the tunnel systems that link the house to the machines. Fairlane is not the prettiest mansion in America. It is not the most opulent, but it is arguably the most honest. It is a house that refuses to lie about its owner. It displays his genius in the engineering of the powerhouse and his darkness in the library. It shows his love for his wife in the rose garden and his cruelty to his son in the architectural dominance of the main hall. Most mansions are built to project an image of who the owner wants to be: sophisticated, royal, cultured. Fairlane was built to be exactly what Henry Ford was: tough, innovative, controlling, paranoid, and utterly self-reliant. Henry Ford built a fortress to keep the world out, to create a controlled environment where he could be the absolute master. But in the end, the river flooded, the lights went out, and the walls couldn't protect him from the mortality that comes for us all. Fairlane stands today not as a monument to a billionaire's wealth, but as a monument to a billionaire's mind, a complex, shadowed, and fascinating place that shaped the 20th century. The engines have stopped, but if you listen closely in the quiet of the library, you can still hear the echo of the ambition that built America.